It's after hours at the Longhorn in Minneapolis with St. Paul just across the river. My name is Leigh Kamman, and I'm sitting opposite Gary Burton at a very strenuous night, but it looked like it was completely relaxed and off the cuff out there. Gary, since your introduction to jazz, what's happened to the jazz composition for one and improvisation for the other? But let's start with the jazz composition. Where was it when you started playing?
Okay, well, the current playing materials when I was learning to play, I came along in the late 50s and early 60s, and it was still very much the short song was the playing form, like the 32-bar song, standard tunes and bebop jazz heads, which were on fairly conventional kinds of chord patterns and usually were 8-bar phrases and therefore relatively predictable and felt fairly natural to the player. And so improvisation had a lot less demands on it as far as structure or surprises for the improviser to assimilate into his playing. Because when the player doesn't want to think about the tune too much while he's playing it, he wants to sort of lose himself in it so that the melodies sort of come more spontaneously. And the more complicated a tune structure is, then the more required of the player to achieve a natural ability to play it without having to become mechanical on it. And I think that's the biggest change over the past 10 to 15 years is that musicians are better able to play more sophisticated structures, where there are maybe measures of a different time signature involved now and then, unusual numbers of measures in a grouping, things that would have been considered awkward 20 or 30 years ago and difficult to improvise on or play on. But now it's quite the standard thing for most players to be able to handle fairly complicated music. And I must throw in also that, just so that people don't get the idea there's only one school of thought on this sort of thing, is that diversity is very prevalent in jazz, always has been, and is probably more so right now than at any other time in its history. So there are groups that play extremely complicated music, and there are groups that also play extremely simple forms and structures, where they have sort of reverted and decided that music has become so sophisticated in complexity that the only thing for them to do is to go back to one chord to play on. And so you hear a lot of bands nowadays will be into that approach, where you hear them sort of vamping over and over on the same harmony instead of having a complicated song. So there's all approaches to it prevalent at the moment because of this diversity.
I heard composers tonight in your programming, Carla Bley for one, and Chick Corea for another. The level of their music is certainly most interesting. Is there a parallel between, say, composers like Bley and Chick Corea, and over here Stravinsky and a few others?
Perhaps, but it'd be hard to make them, I think. The jazz composer just works in a different format. He's playing music that in most cases is meant to be used as a basis for improvisation, which means it will go through lots of changes. So he's looking for usually smaller works. I mean, some of the best jazz pieces ever written are only maybe 8 bars long, or last 30 seconds, and yet it's such an ingenious chord progression that you can improvise on it night after night for your entire life and still find it interesting, intriguing, and fresh for coming up with ideas. And that's the mark of a great jazz composer, that he be able to get down to essentials that way and provide the improviser with something that intrigues him and is also satisfying. And if he can do it in a small, concise way, then it's all the more impressive to the player to deal with.
Is there any parallel in visual art?
That even less likely, I think. There's something about improvisation which is really unique compared to most art forms, and the recording has done some certain amount to destroy this. But music in general, up until recording was invented, was played once each time, each performance, and sent into the air. A performance of a Beethoven symphony each time was a unique experience, because none of them were able to be recorded in those days. So that each time you heard a piece of music, it was one time, and you just retained anything you could in memory, but there was no way to go back and argue over what exactly happened. It was all a matter of one's personal opinion. And that's a terrific thing for the musician, a very abstract art form compared to the kind where there's a painting on the wall, for instance, and you can go back to that painting and look at it over and over again on different days, scrutinize every corner of the canvas until you feel you know it down cold. And your first impression might not be the one you end up with in the end after you've studied it a lot. But with music, the first impression at that performance is the only impression. And for the improviser, all the more so. He's doing conversational music, where he sort of rewords it and rephrases it to fit his feeling at the moment every time he replays a piece, so that there's even more variety from night to night in his music than in the say the written piece that may be performed by an orchestra. So that this spontaneity is a major factor in it, separating it from other art forms, because it isn't scrutinized in the same way. We're going for a very strong communication effect with our immediate audience, as opposed to some sort of search for the universal truth that will live on through the ages with every performance we make. And yet a record does that, which is a dichotomy or a paradox for the jazz musician. I mean, in one sense, he plays each night. It's all new again and fresh, and he gets a new chance to say it all over again and be spontaneous and witty in his music and to the point and get it across to his audience. When you freeze it in time and make it a record, then it has to have this universal quality and this lasting. 10 years later, it still needs to stand up. So it's almost a different psychological concept for the player when he records, as opposed to when he plays a concert.
I see a picture here, particularly the concert, and the picture is that the visual artist works in a studio. The performance, in a way, is the studio for the musician, isn't it?
Yes, and there's this all-important thing of the audience actually being there, because you get feedback from that audience. You just like when you're talking to somebody, you make sort of unconscious recognition of how he's responding to what you're trying to explain to him. You can tell by the look on his face if he's not quite understanding it. Maybe your choice of words is foreign to him, or you're talking too fast and he can't quite follow it, or you're not talking clear enough. There's a lot of distraction around you in the room. It's just like what a player goes through when he plays for an audience. He's weighing the acoustics, the clarity of the room, to which will determine how busily he may play or how complex the music may get on that particular night. He's even choosing vocabulary. He doesn't want to dazzle the audience with his knowledge of harmony. He wants to have them feel how the harmonies move. He wants to tell them the story and get it across to them, as opposed to impressing them. So he's making all these adjustments, and you do need that response from the audience, even though it's hard to describe in words. We don't get a response like saying, well, they didn't like that one because they thought the bass was too loud and such and such. You don't get clear criticisms from them, but you notice which things they're reacting to, and if they're reacting with you at the peaks of the music. And in any normal audience, you sense these things, and that helps you to sort of plan and shape the pacing of the performance. And I think that's the only art form I know that's in are the performing arts, and it plays a big part. I'm sure that a play has a different rhythm to it from night to night based on how the audience is responding to the peaks in the drama, and in some nights will be drastically different from others.
In your sense, too, you edit and cut and program accordingly from your feedback.
Yes, we have certain choices available as we go from tune to tune, and we don't suddenly launch into raindrops falling on my head because we think the people will like it, and we play only our own music, and we play the things that we think will get our message across to the people the clearest. And if I can think of a piece that I think this audience would, if they like that piece, more than the one before, which seemed to be apparent from their applause, then I'm sure they would like this piece, which has some of the same qualities as the one they seem to like the most, and so on. So I'm making those kind of choices as we go along, based on how the audience is reacting to things.
How do you find the climate for today's jazz, Gary?
For us, remarkably good. There's a great variety available, and everyone plays whatever they hear as their own music. The music they identify with strongest is the only one they will be able to play utterly convincingly, and that's what the jazz player will do. And he doesn't have much choice in where it ends up. That's just the natural evolution of his musical personality, and he can't really do much about it once he's arrived at 30 years old and plays the tenor saxophone a certain way. That's the product of 15 years of growth and development, and if he's going to be honest and effective at all, that's what he's going to do, is his thing. And in some cases, the guy may be fairly unlucky, and economically speaking, find that his music is fairly esoteric, and that the likelihood of having an extremely large mass audience is very slim. In which case the guy has to make a decision whether he's going to continue to devote himself to his music and pay the price of perhaps a scuffling existence, or whether he's going to compromise or get out of music altogether, which sometimes is the decision people make. And you may be luckier. I've always thought of myself in this particular way, that I've played what music I enjoy playing most, and in the way I like to play it. And I've considered it my great fortune that enough people like it to come and see our group regularly, to buy our records, to essentially support us, so that we can continue playing it full time and enjoy it, and continue to help it grow and all that. It's my good fortune that the music that happens to be mine has a wide enough appeal. And there are other people who have wider appeal than I do, even, and I don't think you have much control over it.
What medium, Gary, do you think can be truly a force in helping jazz reach audiences, other than the phonograph record and the studio performance and the concert? I think of the electronic media, audio, visual, beyond your normal magazines, newspaper, prints, graphic.
Well, I haven't given that much thought to all that. I suppose, when I think about anybody's typical career, we get assistance one way or another from almost any form of media that we make contact with. I mean, you'll find yourself written up in everything from gardening magazines to whatever. They have one page on record reviews, or you turn up sometimes your name or information about you will turn up in some of the most unlikely places much of the time. And my own feeling is that all of that adds up into being a certain amount of momentum for your career and for your the spreading of your influence through your music, and so that I always welcome it, even if it seems unlikely or off the track from what you'd expect, and that sort of thing. But I don't know. As far as artistically helping the music, I don't think there is anything that could be done to add to what the music does for itself. I think the music, in fact, will take care of itself if the players as long as the players have places to play and audiences to play for. And that's unlikely that that'll ever die out. I mean, George Wein once said that art forms don't die. Styles do, and that sort of thing, and that jazz is an art form as any other, and then by that meaning improvised music is not just a style of music, but in fact an entire form, art of expression unto itself, and therefore its fortunes will rise and fall, but unlikely that it would actually die out.
It takes some dynamic thrust and movement. In fact, the musician who is deeply involved is the medium and the message, isn't he?
Yeah, that's for sure.
Gary Burton, a pleasure sitting in and listening to what you have to say about the art form and its evolution in jazz, and thanks very much in these after hours for discussing it.
My pleasure. Hope to talk to you again sometime.